Um, okay, let's kick this off. We should be live. Welcome everyone to this future of EOAs slash account abstraction breakout room. To give some context, we are currently planning the next hard fork for Ethereum, and there's been a lot of proposals to do something around account abstraction, and depending on the scope and size of it, potentially some bandwidth to include that in this next fork. And the biggest challenge when it comes to doing AA stuff on L1 seems to be the getting everybody to agree on what the right thing is to do, more than the technical complexity of actually doing the thing. And one area where we struggle to get like the input that we need is from like wallet devs, application developers, who are going to be the ones that end up using new account capabilities, and who are the ones sort of in touch with folks who send transactions. So the idea for this call was to try and ideally align people on like, okay, what's a high level roadmap and direction that we'd want AA to go in? What are some things that are like must haves, both in the short and medium term? And then if we can get through that and sort of have a rough consensus around that, looking into the existing proposals or potentially some new proposals that would meet that, both potentially as something to go in the next hard fork, and also something that might be longer term, more ambitious, but making sure that if we do something short term, it doesn't sort of compromise whatever longer term effort we'd want to do. I talked to a few of you this week, or in the past week offline. I think Light Client, you have a pretty good feeling for where the conversation is at. So I think it might help us like start, it might help us to kick things off with just your perspective on the whole thing, and then go from there. As you've been involved in some of the AA proposals, you're obviously on the Gets team, and you've been talking to a lot of the folks on this call as well.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. I can definitely give an overview on how I sort of see the conversation where it's at right now. Basically, we all want account abstraction, and we're trying to find the ways that we can get to that end goal. And the place that we're at now is that we're thinking about how to have quote unquote true account abstraction, native protocol account abstraction. And there's this proposal, we have 4337, and then we have an Enshrining proposal 7560, and I don't feel like that is in a place where it's really something that is going to be considered by all core devs to be enshrined in the near future, namely because it substantially modifies the flow of transactions. It adds many different frames of execution to the transaction flow. And a lot of that stuff to me feels like it's clear from the way that the changes to transactions are coming that it should probably be within the transaction. And so it doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense for it to be in the protocol at this point. So we're trying to think about how to maybe do something different, how to modify 7560 so it's a bit simpler, something like 2938. But unfortunately, 2938 doesn't really address the desires that people have for account abstraction. It doesn't allow paymasters easily. It doesn't allow reoccurring payments. It's a lot more limited than what 7560 is offering. So for true account abstraction, it doesn't feel like there's a clear path to enshrining that. And that we need to do support work and thinking about how to provide that that primitive to users. And we might need to ask if that's something that we should provide to users. For me, given the desires that people have for account abstraction, specifically with paymasters, I don't know if we should be enshrining that type of logic into the protocol. And so to support a paymaster, you need to have different frames of execution, validating the messages from the paymaster, and then after the transaction, sending payments to paymasters. These things start to feel like we're losing a lot of the generality of what we want the protocol to be. And so 4337 as it is today feels like much more clearly the right path forward for that. So there's a lot of discussion that still needs to happen around there. The other big part of the discussion is how can we improve what we have today, because we haven't been able to figure out how to do account abstraction in the protocol yet. And there are proposals to improve EOAs, but there's also this big question of should we do this at all? And I don't have an answer. I don't think anybody necessarily has a specific answer for this. There's the two proposals I think that is listed on the PM in the PM repo on the agenda for this call is mostly 3074 and 5806. So on the axis of improving EOAs, 3074 makes EOAs much better. It's something that could make EOAs compatible with 4337. And in terms of getting users to using smart contract-like functionality, Yoav had a good post where he was comparing 4337 and 3074, and he was saying that 3074 gives you execution abstraction. So 3074 gives you a lot of the UX benefits that users want. What it doesn't give you is it doesn't let you change how you validate transactions. So you don't have this true mechanism for recovering keys, rotating keys out of the account. And a bit of the concern here is, outside of some of the security concerns, 3074 is also, if we make EOAs this much better, are people going to migrate to walls at some point in the future? Or are people just going to stay on EOAs? Are we further enshrining the EOA? Are we further enshrining ECDSA? And that's kind of some questions that are revolving around 3074. 5806 is something that has also been proposed and has been picked up with a little bit more steam in the last month or so. But basically, 5006 just makes EOAs a bit better. It's not necessarily compatible with 4337. It really just addresses the loud squeaky wheel of users wanting to do some operations together. And I think there is a concern that maybe 5806 turns into the next 2930, the access list transaction. Maybe not to this degree, but I do worry that we could come up with some sort of solution, some sort of account abstraction solution that gets people to move off of EOAs, and then we forever have this EOA transaction sitting around that's not terribly useful. And maybe we should go that direction in the near term because it does provide enough value in the near term. To me, this is where I think 3074 shines a little bit more. I think maintaining a transaction time is a bit more effort long term. Maintaining the opcodes for 3074 is a bit easier long term. But 5806 is very safe and very simple. It doesn't really change how you think about the intuition of transactions or anything. So there's a lot of trade-offs between those two proposals. I think there's a couple other ones. We still have to answer the question, though, should we be improving EOAs? And maybe we can talk about that on this call. If we split the difference between native account abstraction and improving EOAs, right now, since we haven't really found this path to whatever end state that we want, I think a reasonable compromise might be to support 7377, which allows EOAs to upgrade to smart contract wallets. I think if we have native account abstraction in the future, or if we don't have it, this is still useful. People are going to have smart contract wallets in the future. So that aligns in that sense. It also sort of improves this EOA experience because at least users today who are using EOAs have the ability to migrate without going through the painful process of sending every single asset. So in terms of minimizing the risk of doing something that's not super useful in 5 to 10 years, I think 7377 is probably minimizes that risk the most. But yeah, lots of questions still to answer. That's kind of my perspective from talking to some other people on the Get team and other core devs.
Thank you. That was a really good context setting. So Danny and Vitalik have their hands up, and I think after that, it'd also be good to hear from some wallet or contract devs because those are the folks who we don't hear from as often. But yeah, Danny.
Yeah, so from your perspective, does 4337 plus 7377 get us where we want to go, but maybe has additional features and too much complexity? Like, does that feature set, is that a feature set at least like a subset of like full account abstraction in your view, or is it missing something?
I think that 7377 plus 4337 gets us pretty much where we're wanting to go. The big problem with 4337, as I understand it, on layer one, and again, like everything I'm saying is in the perspective of layer one. There's totally different perspectives on layer two and how layer twos might go about this. But on layer one, I think
And real quick, when I say 437, I meant like a native version of it, but you can also distinguish
okay.
between those two in your response.
Yeah, so for me, I don't see a lot of reason to. I mean, I don't see that 7560, the native enshrined version of 4337. I think that it changes it too many parts of the transaction flow. I don't think that core devs support having that level of change in the transaction flow. And it doesn't seem clear that you have to do 7560 in the protocol. 4337 should work just as well as 7560. There's some problems with how expensive it costs to transact with 4337. I think that we should be looking at like how can we improve the standard and how can we improve the VM so that the cost of using that standard might be a bit less. The main argument that I've heard for Enshrining 4337 is being able to use, in protocol inclusion lists, stuff like this, but these don't exist in the protocol yet. So until that exists into the protocol, I don't necessarily think that I don't think that we should front run Enshrining 4337 before we have the protocol feature it's claiming that is going to be very useful for it.
Thanks. Vitalik?
Yeah, well, no, thank you so much to both of you, Ned and Danny. And I think the way that I've been coming at this is basically that like in every other branch of Ethereum protocol research and development, like there's been this really big change over the last 5 years, right? Where 5 years ago things felt very blue sky, and there was a lot of kind of holding out for the possibility of future discoveries, and a lot of similar sentiments like that. But now, like basically, like every part of the if every part of the Ethereum roadmap, like there's a mindset that we actually have at this point spent quite a lot of time exploring the idea space, and like we actually need to settle on something, and we need to start building toward it, right? So in the case of the state tree, for example, right, like I think there's like clear agreement around Verkle trees and a possibility of a Stark-friendly upgrade to that at some point in the future. In the case of proof of stake, there's the single slot finality roadmap. In the case of data scaling, there is the data availability sharding roadmap, and at the same time, other forms of layer 2 scaling. And I think that in the wallet space as well, we're at the point where we really are in the position where we can make that mentality shift, but it feels like we haven't quite yet made the mentality shift. And I think like now is exactly the right time when we should make that shift, right? Like I think there actually are quite a few properties of accounts in the Ethereum like long-term game that we generally understand are just security properties that are pretty necessary, right? So like the ability to make key changes and including like revoking old keys from an account, right? This is something that in traditional cybersecurity is like considered a pretty basic thing. Like you should be able to expire a key, take permissions away from a key. This is something that EOAs don't support. It's accepted that eventually quantum computers are going to come, and so there is a flood, like a tsunami, an unknown number of kilometers in the distance that will eventually wash ECDSA away. And like basically, it's our choice of whether whether ECDSAs are something that we move past on our terms or on the terms of that tsunami whenever quantum computers end up coming. There is some more UX side things like batching, sponsorship, signature aggregation, and like we know what proposals that satisfy all of these goals look like, and it, like basically, yeah, the thing that is even more like basically, yeah, figuring out the next step is very difficult if we don't understand what is the long-term goal that the next step is trying to get us closer to, right? And so I think actually, yeah, getting to a stronger agreement on those long-term goals, like what is the a long-term future for accounts that satisfies all of the desires, all the important goals that people have. And if we can get to that consensus, then it gets much easier to actually figure out figure out what some of the initial steps are, and at the same time figure out, like, for example, if in the short term we both have the existing 4337 ecosystem and the existing EOA ecosystem, can we try to improve those in lockstep rather than creating like basically two branches of technology so that we have to deprecate one of them. So the like that's basically for me the rationale of kind of thinking or spending some time to kind of think back to front. And I know that like these sort of all X devs calls tends to be kind of all about like fronts to back, and it's usually sort of quote Ethereum research that does the back to front. But I think like this is a group where we need some consensus on the back to front. Another big thing that I think that is important, I think, to like really get consensus on is just like basically have a clear answer to the question of like, is the Ethereum L1 meant to be in principle a chain that is friendly to users, right? The other vision is basically that like L1 is a B2B chain for L2s. And I know that like some people have that vision and it's a valid vision, but like if we choose that vision, that it has other consequences, right? Like for example, like it's worth canceling EOF, it's worth canceling 3074, it's possibly even worth making an emergency push and canceling T-Store, right? So like basically, yeah, L1 being L2 exclusive is also something that has consequences. And like my personal impression is that generally we do want L1 to be a thing that's that continues to be friendly to users going into the future, even if the bulk of transaction count ends up happening on L2. And then if that's the case, then like that's something that we need to like actually accept and like basically internalize that like whatever the long-term account solution is, that's something that L1 is ultimately going to have to be a part of, and like it's not something that we can sort of punt to some future decision point. So that's I think kind of basically the context for the like where I perceive the need to like really get ourselves aligned around some of these goals. I think on the like client I got an excellent question, which is basically what of all of this stuff does ERC 4337 by itself not satisfy? I think, well, there's three answers. And I think you already mentioned two of them, right? Well, there's like a longer tail of answers, but one of them is, of course, inclusion lists in the future. But in this case, I think the argument basically is that, it is true that changing the protocol to be inclusion list friendly is pointless until we actually have inclusion lists. But I mean, even like while we're talking about the end game, I think it's still worth like in the end game inclusion lists are presumably going to exist, and so within that conversation, it's still worth thinking about them. Another issue is the gas cost stuff, which is definitely super important. The gas cost, and I think like actually the Verkle tree gas cost redesign is probably going to end up solving a lot of that, which is good. I saw one great reply from Vid Kursich, which is the bundler and relayer is not quantum resistant, which doesn't make 4337 like impossible because you can still do stuff like putting it right into a block at the end, but it makes it much more annoying. Another really subtle one that I actually got told about only a couple of days ago, and I wanted to credit, I think it's Aegis 1211 for this, is basically that eStore behaves differently for calls and transactions. Basically, in between transactions, T storage gets cleared. In between 4337 calls, T storage does not get cleared. And so that might lead to different application behavior. And like in the short term, I guess we just have to like yell loudly and make sure applications don't like assume that the T store starts off zeroed. But like that's also one small thing where if user operations actually correspond to transactions, it becomes easier. So yeah, I think those are those are basically the main ones. And then extra complexity to developers is I mean, I think complexity is definitely something that's really important to think about, and like this is also one of those places where it's I think important to kind of like think about an endgame that reunifies some of these structures that we've been creating in the short term, right? But that's definitely also a longer term discussion. Patricio asks, what is IL inclusion lists? Basically, inclusion lists are a technology that allows the protocol to or users to specify a list of transactions and then essentially forces those transactions to be included within one block. And for inclusion lists to like actually work and to be economically sound, like you actually basically the protocol needs to be directly aware of like the concept of a user created object, like the type that like the specific like container that needs to be made censorship resistant. I talked about this quite a bit in my post on like I think it's on HackMD like a year or two ago about like the end game of PBS censorship resistance. So yeah, that's what I wanted to go through.
Thanks. Yeah, a lot to digest. Okay, let's move on to Andrew. Then we'll do Siri.
Yeah, so I agree with Vitalik's vision that L1 should remain somewhat friendly to like normal users, and in that light, I think 3074 is very dangerous because it poses a security risk of signing a blank check. So I'm really worried about 3074. And I think in terms of like practical steps, it's absolutely worth trying to figure out the end game. But it's highly unlikely that we will arrive at a consensus for Prague for the next hard fork. So to my mind, we should implement 5806 because it brings real UX benefits. I don't see for instance, you won't need to do two transactions first to approve a Uniswap exchange and then to actually do the exchange itself. So it'll help with batch transactions. It has real benefits. It's quite simple. I don't see any drawbacks. It does not prevent us from going from implementing a fully blown account abstraction. So yeah, I will do that in Prague.
Thanks. Siri.
Yes, my question is whether there is a proposal right now to enshrine 4337 or 7560 in the next hard fork in Prague, and if not, then maybe it would be best to discuss these proposals when the authors are present. Right now, Yoav cannot join the call because he's in the mid-flight. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of comments around enshrining 4337 as well. I don't know, is there anyone on the call who can give a quick overview of what this actually means? Because there seems to be confusion as well in the chat of like what would get enshrined and what would still rely on off-chain infrastructure. I'm not sure if there's been a specific EIP or something written up for it, but I don't know if anyone even has like just a vague design overview they can share. Okay, so there is a RIP 65, sorry, 7560. Okay. So yeah, I guess in terms of having someone sort of make the case for that, I talked with Yoav. We can discuss this on the Alcor Devs call tomorrow, and I think Yoav should be able to join there. Um, I'd be curious to hear from all the client teams, but there is probably a degree of like complexity that we're bound by as well for the next fork. So I haven't like reviewed this yet, but there's yeah, that's probably the other thing that we should discuss tomorrow. Where like even if we wanted to move forward with something like this, do we have like the bandwidth to include it in the next fork? Yeah, Sharaf.
Hi, yes. I'm Shafat. I'm working with Yoav and Alex and Dror for the 4237 and 7560. And regarding the question about enshrining 4237, this is exactly what 7560 is supposed to be doing. But the way we saw it, we saw 4237 as an ERC and not an EP in order to implement right now a solution for account abstraction and only discuss the other future of account abstraction to discuss enshrining it in the protocol as in 7560 without changing the protocol right now. So I saw some people asking in the chat questions about enshrining 4337 and talking about 7560 without connecting each other. So I just wanted to say that. And also, when we had 4337 and 7560, it was supposed to be our goal was to first introduce it to L2s. In order to see the adoption over there for wallets and other developers and other projects, and only after that we wanted to suggest that to have a native solution for it in L1. So that's why I'm connecting it to what Siri said before. That I think that the best time to speak about 7560 would be farther down the line, especially when Yoav and Dror will be able to join the call.
Got it. And I guess realistically, then, if the plan would be to deploy it on L2s before it's on L1, then it seems extremely unlikely this would land in the next fork and might go into the fork after that. if we'd want to see it used on L2s with like some scale before, before it's on L1. Ansgar?
Yeah, maybe on that point, I just wanted to briefly mention, because this is in principle relevant for, of course, for multiple EIPs that could all be brought to L2s separately or first, before or instead of L1. One problem that has, or like one question that has emerged on that side more and more is that whether we will be able, though, to actually introduce EAPs that require meaningful changes on the layer 2 side if they're not supported by layer 1 and specifically not supported by any of the layer 1 clients. So, for example, Geth has already signaled that they would not support an enshrined version of 437 unless it would at some point come to mainnet. And so then layer 2s would be very hesitant to ship that either. Of course, the solution can be found there, but I'm just basically saying that right now the path for EIPs to be tested or like to be introduced in layer 2s first is a somewhat restricted path, unfortunately.
Got it. Yeah, you obviously need some clients or some fork of them that's maintained by L2 teams to actually implement it and test it. Eric? I hope I said your name right.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to add a few things to the discussion. So this actually goes to the point that Asger also mentioned a second ago. Coming from the wallet side, I know that L2s have a pretty big incentive to remain EVM compatible because of all of the tooling that eventually kind of go by the EVM. And when I say EVM, eventually it's like the Ethereum standard. So indeed, I think that any process right now, without having a new norm, any process that basically pushes L2s to adopt a technology that is not supported by Ethereum is going to be possibly slower or meaningfully slower. So there is this connection right now of like that eventually all of the tooling goes by the standard set by Ethereum at this point. So I think that's something to consider. And I think it's especially important given that when we talk about the things that are needed in order to kind of maybe the cliche of bringing the next billion users to Ethereum, I think gas sponsorship, like transaction sponsorship, is really, really important. And the L2s are actually possibly suffering from this even more. Because they're trying to be facilitating for use cases that are the gateway for a lot of the new users, things around payments, things around NFTs that are not by themselves like digital assets of values, but like NFTs that are part of some other product. So in those situations, getting hold of ETH or Matic has a lot of complications. Sometimes the complications are just tactical, and sometimes they're regulatory. So this is quite preventive from a lot of use cases of adopting EVM L2s to solve this. So I think really sponsorship is really an important issue in the near to medium future, not just long term. So at least from our side, I think it's important to try and solve this as quickly as possible, and understanding that vertical trees are coming, so anything that's not introduced in the next one might be another year and a half to introduce. I think that's just an important consideration to make. And I do think that EOAs do need an improvement, again, kind of for the things that I mentioned. So I do think it's important for us, even though there's a lot of different opinions on what to introduce and how, I would say that it's very important we solve some of the things that Vitalik mentioned, and he kind of went through all of the use cases of the features that need to be solved. So I think it's really important to address as much of it as possible. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, yeah, there's a good question in the chat. So on like a more incremental step, is there a counter argument to not doing 7377, which is the one-time upgrade from an EOA to a smart contract wallet, which can be a 43371 or any other types. And there's a comment saying that potentially some cross-chain interactions.
Yeah, I think Yoav has written about this in one of his posts, but it could be confusing for a user if they have an EOA, they have this private key, and they deploy a smart contract on some chain with that private key. It's like, how do you communicate to that user that that private key is still useful? I mean, one, on that chain already, we need to think about how to deal with the EC recover situation that is being used for permits and other types of ERCs that allow transfers of tokens with signatures. And then on other chains, you need to be able to communicate to the user, hey, don't throw away your private key. You might in the future want to deploy your smart contract wallet to another chain. So there's some issues, some small issues around the experience of using that.
Got it.
Sure. Hi, Alex here. I asked that question in chat. So just coming to the user point of view, though, could we solve that on the wallet side and potentially reduce the burden on a larger hard fork here, the 7377?
Meaning, like, I was just saying, like, meaning make it the responsibility of the wallet to, like, move all of a user's assets over to a different address, or?
Yes, potentially on the UX side, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my impression is that this gets talked about from time to time, but like in practice, it ends up being even harder just because there are so many applications that people like forget that they've never participated in. But I know others have looked at this even more than I have. And
I assume the cost can end up being a barrier, right? Like the whole point is if I have, I don't know, $50 of 20 different tokens, maybe the gas costs on L1 are like prohibitive to individually making those transfers, but a one-time call to change everything to a smart account isn't. Richard?
Yes, just wanted to add also to this question that when it comes to the signature validation cross-chain, right, like if we migrate towards a smart account, this requires that the signature or this ERP 1271, right, like is widely supported and adopted. And I think this is currently still a challenge, which needs to be considered because if and I mean, it was mentioned with Permit, which is the on-chain part of this, but even a lot of off-chain apps first validate your ECDSA signature, and then, if at all, fall back to validating signatures against the smart account. And this obviously, if you suddenly can generate two paths, which is theoretically, you have a private key that can generate a valid signature, but it is actually not the real owner anymore. This creates some indeterministic behavior for a lot of dApps, which either do not get updated or just due to simplicity favor EOAs. And this is something where this from the developer side, which is more off-chain, so I'm not sure how important this is in this round, but there it creates some ambiguity which should be considered and which needs to be somehow addressed.
So I guess summarizing sort of what we've gone so far, it seems like there's a rough alignment on like what we want out of AAs long term. So, you know, the things Vitalik pointed out, I think it's unclear like which of the larger proposals get us there the best. But I guess, yeah, I'd be curious to hear a bit more from like some of the wallet devs or client devs here, like given that we probably have some bandwidth to make some progress on this now across client teams, like what's the most useful thing we can be spending your time on in the next, you know, weeks and months? And potentially that thing is not like something that goes in the next hard fork. Maybe it's something that goes in the next, in the one after, if it's like figuring out a path forward for say 7560 or something like that. But yeah, I guess this comes up all the time where yeah, it's like there's this demand to do something to improve the UX, to make things easier for users and whatnot. And we do have some capacity now. So like, yeah, what the wallets, what the contract devs think would be highest impact or most valuable to prioritize. Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, so slightly repeating, but not fully. I think in terms of the improvements that would be useful on our side, I think, again, like I would say that probably the first priority is sponsored transactions, because it unlocks a lot of use cases, again, on L1s and L2s. I think following after that, I wouldn't say batching, but more like EVM execution in general, from an EOA account. Now, I'm not sure that an upgrade is as useful because it introduces a lot of complexity. If I'm somebody who manages 1 million clients of mine, then starting to upgrade some of them to smart contracts versus others are still regular EOAs creates a bit of a complex ecosystem to manage. So again, maybe it's a path forward, but I'm not sure it's very progressive slowly, right? Like it's more like a big change to make as somebody who has a product in the space. But definitely executing EVM code from the EOA is useful, and especially it's useful if I can do this in a sponsored transaction. So the combination of those two use cases is very useful. This is why kind of like the 3074 suggestion is appealing. I understand there are some concerns about the security. I know that there's suggestions to do this a single transaction instead of like supporting for indefinite approval. I'm not sure how many of the concerns this alleviates in terms of the security, because then it's much closer to 5806, if I remember the number correctly. But just generally speaking, I think those two things would be the top priorities. From our side, not as just a wallet that is end user wallet, but actually more as like enabling other companies that are building their end user products. Yeah.
Thanks. That's pretty valuable. Other thoughts, comments? Okay, I guess so. Sponsored transactions, the ability to have more complex execution flowing out of an EOA and figuring out the best migration path to do that, and the trade-offs of like converting existing accounts versus not. If we did either of those things, do they like block us in any future end games? You know, if we went ahead and did something like 3074 or something like 7377 or to both of them, and then we deploy, say, Enshrine 4337 on L2s, realize this is great, and then in 2 years want to move it to L1, have we like painted ourselves in the corner? Is this basically, Vitalik, you mentioned at the start of the call, you know, the idea of like there's these two branches of development. Does this mean we just sort of have to live with that and deprecate one, or have wallets support both forever? Because it does seem like the sort of types of proposals we can consider for L1 right now are like different than what's being proposed in something like the Enshrine 4337? And how bad is it to do both those things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, on the like in convert to smart contract side, it feels like the sort of thing that's not forward incompatible with anything, because or at least it's not forward incompatible with other proposals, because it's like once you have a a smart contract wallet, like if it's written sanely, it has a self-upgrade functionality, and so you'll be able to convert it to some different type of smart contract wallet in the future anyway. And I'll let others speak on like forward compatibility of 3074 and Azure and like long-term conversion to smart contract wallets.
So I guess, yeah, there are a couple comments and on this based around, like fully deprecating EOAs, but is this something we can ever actually do? So if I just like log out of Ethereum, stop paying attention today and come back in like 4 years, is it likely, is it possible that we can like fully deprecate EOAs ever, right?
Right. I mean, the thing that we'd have to do is we'd have to basically make a create 5 opcode that initializes an account at an address that is just based on the hash of a public key, whose code is just then like some standardized thing that is that accepts CCDSA signatures from that public key.
Got it.
Yeah, like the big thing to keep in mind is like there is always going to be a smart contract design that is able to create equivalent functionality to what EOAs do. So, yeah.
And we can arguably, just have
right.
process that in
exactly.
the background. Yeah.
Exactly. We can arguably force convert EOAs into smart contracts with equivalent functionality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the concern, like with some of the EOA empowering designs, might be that, like, if you start putting the idea of an EOA into an opcode, then like that starts becoming more dicey because, like, sure, like you could support smart contract wallets, but then you'd be supporting a very specific kind of smart contract wallet. That like.
Yeah, Ansgar, you have a comment about the L1 versus L2 perspective. Do you want to share a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking that it's only basically for further informing the context for our decisions, but I do think that it makes a difference whether you think about this as like we want to improve the situation for users on layer one, or we just want to change layer one because for better or worse, right now most layer twos follow the standards that layer one sets, and layer twos is where most of the users are. I personally really think that we should be okay with embracing that layer one will be more the settlement layer, especially as we hopefully get more wider and wider adoption. Most users will be most of the time priced out from layer one anyway. So I think focusing on just the power users on layer one doesn't really make much sense. So I personally really think that the reason to even think about any of this is mostly for kind of guiding layer twos. And again, I'm not saying that necessarily makes an actionable difference, but I do think in terms of mindset, it's important to, I think to have a picture for.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think in parallel, you sort of want to think about the handoff or the like, L2's ability to incorporate new standards. So, like you were saying earlier, if like clients currently don't support like L2 specific features, you'd hope over time this changes. It doesn't seem like an unsolvable problem, but it means, in the next year or so, it's more likely that like L1 is the one sort of setting the direction more heavily, and L2 sort of starts ramping up in like, if and how they can adopt independent features. But then maybe 3 years from now, this has like shifted. So I think it's like worth considering that like L1 probably can have like a heavier hand now, but over time, that may stop being true. And if that's the case, are there specific things we'd want to do now while everybody sort of follows what L1 does? Vitalik, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the challenge that I see with L1 sort of being almost compatible but not quite, right, is basically that I expect wallets will want to try to provide equivalent functionality on as many chains as possible, and L1 is just realistically going to be one of them for a pretty long time, and so if like chain wallets like just all have to write custom code for L1 that just to like serve the particular people groups of people that do use it, then like that is a significant burden on the ecosystem, even if only like 0.5% of people 5 years from now actually have L1 accounts. So that's I think a big part of my reason for like basically saying that you know like either we're supporting L1 or if we're deciding that L1 is not for users, then like actually more fully embracing that.
Okay, so um, it does seem, I guess, coming back to like Matt's first comment, like we're in this sort of impasse almost where um, either we sort of lean into these larger sort of account abstraction overhauls, whether this is something like Enshrine 4337, whether this is something like 2938 and whatnot, and we could have like a separate conversation about all those in more depth. And I think if we only focus on that, this means that the status quo remains the same on L1 for the next year or so, which might be fine. People will complain about it on Twitter and then say that we do nothing for users. But it seems like alternatively, we go with like what are the smallest incremental improvements we can make on L1. Do those now while the sort of broader roadmap gets fleshed out. And be mindful of like their forward compatibility with that. And it's not clear what the set of like L1 net improvements that don't potentially conflict with the larger AA solutions is, but we can think through that a bit better. But yeah, do people generally agree this is like where we're at? Or does anyone see another sort of path? Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the alternative. But to my mind, like the one of this, like the smaller EAPs, like 5806, it doesn't conflict with any bigger account abstraction proposal. Yes, there will be a new legacy transaction type, but so what? It's like it doesn't matter. We will have some legacy stuff anyway, so it doesn't introduce any new incompatibility in principle.
I mean, it specifically doesn't support account abstraction. It's going off at a completely different branch. And not only that, it doesn't support two of the most important features to people, which is key rotation and paymasters. So it's just addressing like the third most useful thing for users. I don't think it's worth enshrining that into the protocol forever.
Well, it's I think okay, maybe not necessarily that one, but we can maybe consider a small EAP to address the first like the sponsored transactions or whatnot. But why I'm talking about 5806, because I think it's simple to implement. It doesn't introduce an incompatibility, and it does bring a benefit.
I mean, I would just rather enshrine 3074 with the requirement that the message is only valid for the account, for the current nonce of the account. So you're not writing this blank check forever. That to me is a much more useful feature that it provides a lot more flexibility to improve the EOA than a very specific improvement around transaction batching that 5806 provides.
Okay, if 3074 is amended to prevent this signing of a blank check forever, then yeah, I guess we should. Yeah, I haven't looked into it in detail because my biggest worry was that we're just signing a blank check. If it's not the issue, then yeah, I personally need to think more about it. But what you're saying makes sense.
Shahaf and then Vitalik.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Matt because he mentioned before that in the GET team they are reluctant to change the way transactions are being validated. I think for the 7560 proposal. So I just wanted if you could just elaborate a bit on why is that the case.
I mean, I think we're generally trying to avoid changing the protocol in substantial ways. And this is a pretty substantial change on how to think about transactions and how to build blocks. It's not something that, we're necessarily 100% against. But my biggest argument against Enshrining 4337 is that there isn't really a clear reason to do it. Things like Verkle, you can't not enshrine Verkle. You can't have Verkle live at the application layer, where 4337 seems to be used in production. There are some rough edges around the cost of using it on L1, but these are things that I think that could just be improved over time. Whereas, enshrining and doing these changes to the protocol, we should only be making these like large changes to the protocol if they're absolute necessities. And I don't see that as the case yet for 4337 enshrinement. But like moreover, on to Ansgar's point, which I don't know if that's what you're referring to, where he was saying that the GET team has signaled to not support things on L2 before it goes to L1. This is just generally a decision that we don't feel like it's our role to maintain the code that L2s only are running. It's already a lot of work just to maintain and make sure that the L1 protocol is staying up and everything is correct. And if we need to do like large code refactors, and this is the big thing with 7560, I don't think the Geth is going to support it before it is having L1 support, because it is a very large change to the behavior of our transaction pool, our block builder, and our block validation. So we would change many different modules just to support L2s. And that's probably not something that we're going to be going down in the near future.
Okay, so we're about at time for the hour. I think what probably makes sense from here is on tomorrow's Awkward Devs call, we can, one, have Yoav give kind of a deeper overview in 4337. Unfortunately, him and his team couldn't make it today, so giving them the space to do that. Two, I think it would be great if we can dive into the specific EIPs for the next fork a bit more and their trade-offs. So it seems like 3074, 5806 in terms of like enabling new functionality are like the two main contenders. And then Ansgar, also you had a draft EIP, I forget what the number is, that was just like a new transaction type with a sponsor. And then we have 5806 and 7377 with regards to like converting EOAs to smart accounts or smart contracts. Yeah, I don't know, does this seem reasonable to people to get a bit more of the high level around 4337 and then look at the smaller potential changes for the next fork tomorrow and take it from there? And in the meantime, there's also the R&D Discord if people want to continue discussing this. So we have the future EOAs channel. So I'll post the link here. But yeah, I think this gives us a decent, overview to keep working on. Anything else before we wrap up? Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming on. Appreciate you all spending the time, and we'll talk to you tomorrow about this stuff some more.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jim, thanks everyone.
Thanks.